So I'm going to talk about the PAWS operating model, which is a document that the PAWS admins came up with over the last kind of 4 or 5 months. We posted about it online. I'll talk about kind of what led to it and give an overview of what's in it. If you've got any questions, probably best to keep them to the end. So you're probably all familiar with the life cycle of most CPAN authors. So you write a module, you upload it onto CPAN, everyone starts using it, fame and fortune follows, and then you find yourself on Graham Norton. Though, sadly, there are some people who don't follow this usual path, and there are some interesting cases that come up. Some of those interesting cases is really what has led us to document them in the PAWS operating model, kind of how to deal with the edge cases of who owns what and who can release what, etc., onto CPAN. So there's a document you can find online called the PAWS operating model. It's a long document, but I'm just kind of going to give the highlights of it. So you're all familiar with CPAN. It's just a big blob of modules online, and you can go and download things from it. This is kind of a quick overview of how it works. So hands up here who knows what PAWS is and has a pretty good idea of what PAWS is. So most of you. So PAWS is essentially the gateway of how you get things onto CPAN. And so if you're an author of a Perl module, that's what you use to get things onto CPAN. So lots of people who use CPAN don't know anything about PAWS. It's mainly just the authors. There's also this shadowy group of people known as the PAWS admins. Is Andreas here? There he is, our glorious leader. The shadowest of them all, yes, is another way of thinking about it. So the PAWS operating model kind of says, how does the PAWS system work, but also how do the PAWS admins administer the system as well. So I'm a PAWS admin, Andreas is a PAWS admin. There are about 5 to 10 active admins, but there are also some historical ones as well, and you'll see who those are a bit later. So a quick primer on how CPAN works. What happens when you upload something to CPAN? So let's say we've got a user, Zaphod, and he's decided to write a Twitter module. This is back in 2006, I guess. So you write a module in lib.twitter.pm, and you've got your main package, Twitter, but you might have some sub-packages as well. He does a release of this and uploads it, and he's got a tarball here that identifies the version. When it goes to PAWS, this kind of gives you a little look inside PAWS. So you're probably aware that there's a bunch of CPAN mirrors around the world, and there's a master, and basically everything comes off the master. Inside PAWS, there's the web service that you talk to, and that's where you're uploading your stuff. There's a database that holds metadata about users and modules and releases. There's a bunch of scripts that periodically run and generate information and put it into what I've called pre-CPAN here. When you upload your files, they go into pre-CPAN, and I'll just kind of quickly go through the structure of that. So you're probably familiar with the kind of or you might not be, the directory structure that every CPAN mirror has. So the main ones are authors, modules, indices, source, and there's a bunch of recent files at the top that you can query to find what are the things that have recently been uploaded. Most of the interesting action goes on in the authors directory and the modules directory. So Zaphod uploads his thing, and it goes into his author directory. And this path here, authors ID ZZA Zaphod, that is his author directory. Most of CPAN is that you can think of as the union of all of those author directories. I'm not sure the percentage, but I'm sure it's more than 95% of the bytes of what's on CPAN is basically just the collection of those author directories. One of the things that PAWS generates is something called the CPAN index. And this is a special file that lists all the modules that are available on CPAN for download. There's lots of other stuff on CPAN, but if you want to install something, it's got to be in the index. And this is basically just a big text file that lists all modules on the side, or packages. So remember, there was a Twitter package, but there were 2 other packages that weren't modules. So the index has all packages. So if you go and type cpan on one of these packages, it then goes and looks on the right, it finds the path, that tells it the author directory, and it will go and download that and install it. So if you want to install this one particular module, then your cpan client knows I go and download this file. So our user Zaphod, he would end up with this kind of entry in the index. So let's say he was the first person who uploaded it, then his release would go into the index. But PAWS has this thing called indexing permissions, and this is how it controls who is allowed to release what and whose releases of what will end up in the index. These indexing permissions are essentially a tuple of a package, an author, and the type of permission they have. So when you upload something, PAWS checks this to see, do you have permission for this, an indexing permission? And if you do, then it will end up in the index. One of the periodic scripts that PAWS runs is something that generates the basically a dump of all the permissions. So if you want to know who has permissions on a certain package, you can just go and download this file. It's in the modules directory, where there's a bunch of other interesting things in there, and you can go and query it. There are some Perl modules for querying that as well. And it basically looks like this. It's a CSV. So that previous example we saw, David Golden, if he releases Devel Autoflush, then it will be indexed. And the F there says that he was the first person to release it. So he's essentially the owner of that namespace. So after Zaphod does his release, he will end up, assuming no one else has done a Twitter module, of course, he will end up with first come permissions on those 3 packages. So remember, it's packages, not modules, that get indexed. And this first come basically means any of your releases are eligible to go in the index. You can grant co-main to other people. You can give this permission to other people. You can drop it for now, but we're going to change that. And the key thing here is if you're the first person to release that package, you are given first come automatically. Co-main is when your project becomes wildly successful and you need a minion to do releases for you, you give them co-main, and that basically says they're not in charge, but they can do releases, and their releases will get indexed as well. Some quick statistics for you. 70% of things on cpan have just a first come permission, so you can see that is the bulk of it. Someone releases their module and no one else ever releases that module again. The next biggest group is 12.6%, which is 1 first come and 1 co-main. So together that is the bulk of what's on cpan. Bonus fact for you, there are 2 packages that have a first come and 36 co-mates, and a prize for anyone, not really a prize, who'd like to guess the namespace of those that is? No. No. Okay, so Catalyst, basically. So, but there's a problem with having just first come and co-main, in that if a project becomes really successful, then you might want your minion to be able to start giving release permissions to other people, and you just want to basically act as the benevolent overlord. And so what we're going to do is add a new permission level called admin, which is basically someone who can grant co-main, but they're not the owner. So this is something that kind of came out of the review process, that this was a new permission level we needed. Hasn't been implemented yet. Maybe Andreas will be implementing it on the plane home. There's a whole bunch of other things that affect whether your package will get in the index. You can just have a quick skim through. I'm not going to go those. So permissions are the main thing, but once you get past the permissions gate, there's a whole bunch of other things as well. So, but the reality of cpan authors is that people come and go. Their enthusiasm for giving their stuff away and replying to emails, etc., kind of ebbs and flows. Large projects attract multiple people. People disagree, they fall out, they forget things, they change their mind, and people retire, and sadly people pass away. So I did some analysis on what is typical cpan author longevity. So from the first release to the last release that they've done on cpan. So you can see most people basically You do releases in 1 year and we never hear from them again. And then way out here, there are, now I've forgotten, I think it's 9 people who have been doing releases for 22 years, the longest of which is sitting here in the corner. And then I thought, well, okay, let's have a look at months. And so actually you'll see the spike is basically lots of people do a release, or 1 or 2 or 3 releases all in 1 month, and then it's perfect and they don't have to do another release ever again. Why are you laughing at that comment? So this module works for most people 90+% of the time, but there are some interesting edge cases. The most common one is where a module is no longer maintained. So you're using a module, you find a bug or you want some new feature in it, you mail the author and you hear nothing. And it's been a long time since the last release, and you'd like to, now you've fixed a bug or implemented some awesome new feature, you would like that to get onto CPAN. First thing you should do is email the author, because lots of people, when you mail them, you might have to track them down a bit. They'll say, oh yeah, fine, here you go. They'll give you co-mate, or they might even give you first come permissions. If it bounces, go and look for other ways of contacting them that might be LinkedIn, etc. But sometimes you never get a response. You might get bounces, you can't track them down, or the email is clearly going there, but you're just getting no response. So we have this concept of an unresponsive author. If you've tried contacting someone and you really want to do this release, that's one of the times you contact the Perl admin, and this is the most common scenario. And you basically ask for co-mate. And if you can show some due diligence, we might do some diligence as well, and then you'll get co-mate and you can do releases. It still belongs to that person who has copyright because they created it, but you can now do releases. And this happens a lot on CPAN. And there are several modules that have had 5 different people kind of passing it on. Popular modules this happens to. Sometimes you might disagree with what the first come has done. So you start using a module and then the person suddenly gets some crazy idea and zooms off here. One of the things we made very clear on this is the person who owns the module, it's their module. If you disagree, pretty much everything on CPAN, you can fork it and provide your own version if you want to keep it stable, etc. You cannot go to the pause admins and say, this guy's an idiot, give me control please, because lots of us are using it. It can be very frustrating, but we kind of wanted to clarify. If someone created it, they get to maintain control, as long as they're not being offensive or breaking any laws. Sometimes you get modules with no first come. At the moment, as I said, you can drop your first come permission, which kind of leaves it in a bit of a zombie state. Sometimes this happens accidentally. Someone's using the web interface, they meant to give it to someone else, they do the wrong thing. That's another scenario when they come to us and we fix it out. So as you see, there are nearly 3,000 packages like that. What we're going to do in the future is, if you want to drop your ownership of a package, it will automatically get the adopt me flag on it, which says this is available for someone else to come along and take over, and there's a kind of a well-defined process for that. So there's a bunch of other things in the operating model. One thing we did was kind of sit down and try and think, well, what are the underlying principles here that should apply? And in particular, something I said a few minutes ago, the 4th point here, which is basically kind of a key underlying principle really for us, is if you create a module, as long as you don't infringe on anyone else's rights, you don't include offensive content, then you get to decide what happens to your module. And kind of that is kind of, for 99.something% of the time, that's the model. And we're kind of here to help out in the funny edge cases around that. And this is a service that's provided to the community, both CPAN and PAWS, and as long as you don't mess it up for anyone, then everything should be fine. Another way of putting that, perhaps more concisely, is this. And most people kind of get that. And actually, people being a jerk is a tiny, tiny percentage. It is an incredibly smooth running, collaborative kind of effort, CPAN. Every now and then scenarios come up though, and there have been a few historically, and it was going through those that let us identify things that we needed to put into the PAWS operating model. It's just version 1. If there's scenarios you think that aren't covered, please let us know, send us a pull request. There are some other things covered in the PAWS operating model. what developer releases are, the benefits of them and how you do them, some special pause IDs. I already mentioned the adopt me one. What happens when a CPAN author passes away. There was a well-defined process. It's now a well-defined and well-documented process for what happens there. Not treading on other people's toes. If you want to release a module that is then going to go in someone else's namespace, whether at runtime or installation time, there are a few modules on CPAN that do that. Now there's a very clear model for how to do that the right way. What happens if your module gets proposed to be a core module? It's ultimately your say on whether it gets into CPAN, but once it's in there and has become a core module, you give up some of your control on it for hopefully obvious reasons. The pumpkin was sitting there, he's just disappeared. There's a bunch of stuff on licensing and copyright. Mainly it says we're not lawyers, but it also says you really should have a license when you upload it, and you should have a clear copyright. If you don't, it makes life a lot harder for distribution builders. And a question that a couple of people have asked as well is, who are the admins? When you go to the web interface, there's a little link on the side, and you can find out the pause IDs. So yes, so you'll probably recognise a lot of these, and various people have kind of come and gone over the years. Some people were there at the start and are still there. So I have 4 minutes left. So firstly, I'd like to thank the sponsors, without which this wouldn't be possible. And then, are there any questions? I've got 4 minutes if there are any questions. It was all so clearly, oh damn. I mean, yes, what's your question?
What happens once something adopts me? Is that then first come, first served, or is there a more
So, good question. So the question was, when something's got adopt me on it, what happens? So it's kind of like a flag that says this is available for adoption. And you can then basically apply to the pause admins and say, I'd like to take this module over. If it's a module that no one else is using on CPAN, then you'll get it straight away. If it's a module that is, are you familiar with the CPAN River model? Kind of like, it's kind of a measure of how many other distributions on CPAN are relying on it. If it's shitloads, then that is the technical term. Then the pause admins will go and look to see what other distributions are using this, what communities around this, and is there a more appropriate person to take it over. And in a small number of cases, we have kind of proactively gone and found someone and said, we think you would be awesome. You are clearly relying on this module in a number of ways. Would you like to take it over? Some of the time they'll say, oh, actually, yeah, I would, thank you. We're using this all the time. Other times not. Sometimes the person who comes along and says, I'd like to adopt it. If we go and look at their account on CPAN, we can see, okay, they've clearly got the cred for this. Yes, no problem. So part of kind of our due diligence is to feel that we're doing the right thing for the community. But in 99.something% of the time, it just goes on smoothly. Someone wanting to basically put in work and help maintain bits of CPAN is generally kind of received with open arms.
Generally, you don't have to outbid Madonna for it.
No. So a very small number of situations that's happened in. We've got another scenario at the moment where there's a module that a whole bunch of us are relying on. I'm one of the people relying on it, and we're all trying to nominate each other to be the person. So you seemed like you really understand this a lot better than me. Why don't you take it over? I want someone to be maintaining it because the original guy has kind of stopped. If there's anyone here who's familiar with SAML, you have my deepest condolences, but there's a lovely module that really needs someone to look after it. Any other questions? I have about 1 minute. Ishigaki-san.
So the new admin permission is to help not big group of people for conflicting interests. But is there any permission or is there any change to help long-time contributor with comment permission and who wants to step down and to pass the permission?
So at the moment, you can't pass co-mains on, and the idea is that for most distributions there should be someone who is essentially kind of like the steward who gets to decide that. So normally a co-main person would go to that person and ask them. If that person has disappeared or there isn't one, those 2,800 cases, then they can apply to the pause admins to get admin when we've done it, or to get first come, so that they can then maintain it. So there is a path. Was there a question somewhere over here for?
So when an author dies, what is the process?
So first we confirm that has actually happened. So we'll look for an obituary, talk to someone who is in the know, just to, it's not someone trying to pull a fast one, which we've never had. And then their permission, all the modules are then marked as adopt me. And if they're high up the river, so lots of people are relying on them, we will then, in some cases, proactively go and find someone to adopt them.
Do you actually promote that somebody's died somewhere, or that's happened?
We don't. You know, if they're well known, then typically there'll be an obituary posted somewhere online. But possibly we should have a little bit more of a process around it. But people are always slightly unsure what's exactly the right way to deal with this.
I mean, because I run or manage the firstcome authors in memorandum, and occasionally I'll get various people saying, "Oh, so and so died." I'm like trying to find out.
We should sync up. We should talk about this a bit more afterwards.
Because in some cases they haven't been identified with you guys, so that becomes a bit difficult then
Okay.
to see, well, is this person deceased or what?
I think that's me out of time. So thank you very much.